What you're about to hear is one of the most shocking confrontations in Mount Everest history. A single woman against 100 furious Sherpas. Rocks thrown, death threats were shouted. A chase down the deadliest mountain on Earth. This isn't fiction, this actually happened. And the woman at the center of it all? She'd go on to become one of the most controversial figures in mountaineering history. April 27th, 2013. Camp 2 on Mount Everest is situated at 21,000 feet. The air is thin, the temperature brutal. 3 elite European climbers are preparing for what should be a routine acclimatization climb. The 3 climbers were Ueli Steck, a Swiss machine known as one of the fastest alpinists alive, Simone Moro, the Italian helicopter pilot and mountaineer, and Jonathan Griffith, a British photographer and climber. These weren't amateurs. Between them, they had decades of elite climbing experience and numerous first ascents. But here's where things get interesting. That day, they made a decision that would nearly cost them their lives. And what happened next would expose deep tensions that have been building on Everest for years. Tensions between Western climbers and the Sherpa community that most tourists never see. But before we get to the rocks being thrown and the death threats, you need to understand what these 3 climbers did that morning that angered an entire village of mountain warriors. Because what seems like a simple misunderstanding was actually something much deeper. A clash of cultures, respect, and survival on the world's tallest peak. Before we go any further, if you're interested in real stories from the most dangerous places on Earth, stories that reveal what most people never hear, subscribe to the channel. And as you're watching, leave a comment below. Whose side are you on? The climbers or the Sherpas? The setup: Mount Everest isn't just a mountain, it's a business. A deadly, high-altitude business worth millions of dollars every climbing season. And in 2013, that business was booming. Hundreds of climbers were paying upwards of $65,000 each for a chance to stand on top of the world. But here's what most people don't understand. Those Western climbers paying all that money, they're not the ones doing most of the work. The Sherpas are. They're the ones fixing the ropes, carrying the loads, setting up the camps, risking their lives again and again, often for a fraction of what their clients are paying. Ueli Steck was different from most Everest climbers though. He wasn't there to follow a guided route, he was attempting something ambitious. A new route on Everest's west face. Fast and light, alpine-style. No fixed ropes, no massive support team. Just 3 skilled climbers moving quickly. On the morning of April 27th, the trio woke up at Camp 2 and noticed something. The lot's face above them was empty. Normally, this section of the mountain would be crawling with Sherpas fixing ropes for the commercial expeditions. But that day, it was quiet. They saw a few Sherpas working about 150 feet to their right, but the face directly above them was clear. So they made a decision. They would climb up, do some filming, and practice their route. Standard acclimatization. They weren't planning to get in anyone's way. It should have been simple. But what they didn't know was that those Sherpas working nearby had a very different understanding of what was happening on that mountain that day. And when Steck, Moro, and Griffith started climbing, they triggered a chain of events that would turn the entire Sherpa community at Everest Base Camp against them. What started as shouting would escalate into something none of them could have predicted. The confrontation begins about an hour into their climb. Things started to go wrong. The 3 climbers were moving up the lot's face when they heard shouting from below. It was the Sherpas fixing ropes. They were angry, very angry. According to the Sherpas' account, the climbers were knocking ice and rocks down on them while they worked. In mountaineering, this is serious. A falling rock at high altitude can kill someone instantly. The Sherpas yelled up, telling them to stop, to wait, to let them finish their work first. But here's where the stories diverge. Steck and his team claimed they were climbing a completely different line, at least 150 feet away from where the Sherpas were working. They insist they weren't dislodging anything dangerous. They shouted back that they'd be careful, and they kept climbing. From the Sherpas' perspective, this was unacceptable. Not just dangerous, but disrespectful. These weren't clients who had paid their dues. These were independent climbers who seemed to be ignoring their requests, putting their lives at risk, and disrupting the critical work of fixing ropes that dozens of paying clients depended on. The lead Sherpa fixing ropes that day was a man who had been described in various accounts as one of the more senior and respected figures. When the 3 Europeans continued climbing despite the warnings, he became furious. Words were exchanged. The situation was escalating. Steck, Moro, and Griffith eventually decided it wasn't worth the conflict. They turned around and headed back down to Camp 2. They figured they'd talk it out, apologize if necessary, and move on. After all, they were all climbers. They were all on the same mountain. What they didn't realize was that word of the incident was already spreading through the Sherpa community like wildfire. And by the time they reached their tents, a mob of angry Sherpas was forming. What happened next would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives. Because sometimes on Everest, an apology isn't enough. The ambush When Steck, Moro, and Griffith arrived back at Camp 2, they tried to find the Sherpas they'd had the confrontation with to talk things through. They found one of them and attempted to explain their side. According to their account, the conversation started relatively calmly, but then things changed. Fast. More Sherpas began arriving. 10, 20, 50. Before long, approximately 100 Sherpas had gathered around the three climbers. The mood was hostile. According to the Europeans, the Sherpas were shouting threats. Some were holding rocks. The situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Moro, attempting to defuse the tension, tried to apologize. But according to multiple witnesses, this made things worse. One of the Sherpas allegedly struck Moro in the face. Steck tried to intervene and was also hit. Rocks started flying. The three climbers were surrounded, outnumbered 30-1 at 21,000 feet, where help was miles away and rescue nearly impossible. Jonathan Griffith later described the experience as genuinely terrifying. He said they were told they would be killed. They needed to leave the mountain immediately, or they wouldn't survive the day. Tents from other expeditions nearby were reportedly damaged. The confrontation had become a riot. But here's what makes this story even more complicated. Other climbers at Camp 2 that day, including some who witnessed parts of the confrontation, have given varying accounts. Some supported Steck's version of events. Others suggested the Europeans had been more aggressive or disrespectful than they later admitted. Some said the Sherpas had legitimate grievances that went beyond just the icefall incident. So what really happened on that mountain? Was this a simple misunderstanding that got out of hand? Or was something deeper going on? Years of tension finally exploding? And how did 3 elite climbers manage to escape from 100 angry men in one of the most remote and dangerous places on Earth? The answer involves a legendary mountaineer making a desperate rescue attempt. The escape, with rocks flying and death threats in the air, Steck, Moro, and Griffith realized they had only one option: run. But you can't exactly run at 21,000 feet. The air is so thin that walking feels like sprinting. Every step is exhausting, and they were surrounded. Melissa Arnot, an American climber who was at Camp 2 that day, and one of the most experienced Everest guides in the world, witnessed the confrontation escalating. She later said she'd never seen anything like it in all her years on the mountain. She and several other Western climbers attempted to intervene, forming a protective barrier around the 3 Europeans. The Sherpas reportedly gave them an ultimatum: leave the mountain within an hour or face consequences. Some accounts suggest that several Sherpas went back to base camp to get more people. The implication was clear: this wasn't over. Steck, Moro, and Griffith quickly packed their essential gear. They couldn't go down immediately because they'd have to pass through Camp 1, where even more angry Sherpas might be waiting. Instead, they hid. They literally hid in other climbers' tents, waiting for darkness. As night fell, they began their descent, moving quietly, hoping to avoid another confrontation. They navigated the treacherous 𝐂𝐚𝐲 icefall in the dark, one of the most dangerous sections of the Everest route, where massive ice towers can collapse without warning. Normally, climbers avoid the icefall at night, but facing the mob again seemed even more dangerous. They made it through. By the time they reached base camp, news of the incident had spread to the international climbing community. Journalists were already picking up the story, and the 3 climbers faced a choice: stay and try to resolve things, or leave Nepal entirely. But here's what nobody expected. This incident wasn't just going to blow over. It was about to expose a massive divide in the mountaineering world, one that had been growing for decades. And at the center of it all was a question nobody wanted to ask: who really owns Everest? The aftermath. In the days following the confrontation, both sides told their stories to the press. Ueli Steck, Simone Moro, and Jonathan Griffith gave interviews describing the attack. They showed photos of their injuries. They talked about fearing for their lives. International climbing organizations expressed outrage. How could this happen? How could skilled alpinists be attacked by the very people who are supposed to be their partners on the mountain? But then the Sherpa side of the story began to emerge, and it was very different. According to multiple Sherpa accounts, the 3 climbers had not only endangered the rope-fixing team by knocking down ice and rocks, but had also been verbally abusive. Some reports claimed that when asked to stop, one of the climbers responded with profanity and ethnic slurs. The Sherpas said they felt disrespected, treated like servants rather than fellow mountaineers. One Sherpa who was present that day gave an interview to a mountaineering website describing years of accumulated frustration. Western climbers treating Sherpas as expendable, paying them minimal wages while charging clients enormous fees, taking credit for summits that Sherpas made possible, expecting the Sherpas to risk their lives repeatedly while treating them as invisible. The incident from this perspective wasn't about 3 specific climbers, it was about a system, a power dynamic that had been building for generations. And on that day, it finally exploded. Other climbers at base camp tried to mediate. There were meetings. Apologies were offered and rejected. Some Sherpa leaders called for calm, saying violence wasn't the answer, but others remained furious, insisting the Europeans needed to leave Nepal and never return. Eventually, Steck, Moro, and Griffith did leave. They flew out of Nepal, their Everest expedition abandoned. But this story doesn't end there, because what happened on Everest that day in 2013 was just a preview of something much bigger that was coming. 1 year later, a tragedy would occur that would change Everest forever and prove that everything the Sherpas had been angry about was real. The deeper truth: to understand why 100 Sherpas nearly killed 3 experienced climbers, you need to understand the economics and culture of Everest. And it's darker than most people realize. Sherpas are an ethnic group from the mountainous regions of Nepal. For generations, they've lived in some of the highest villages on Earth, adapted to altitude in ways that give them a genetic advantage. They've been climbing these mountains for centuries, long before Western mountaineers ever arrived. When commercial Everest expeditions began in earnest in the 1990s and 2000s, Sherpas became essential. They could work at altitudes that would incapacitate most people. They knew the mountains intimately. And crucially, they were willing to do the most dangerous work for relatively low pay. A Western climber pays $65,000 to $90,000 to climb Everest. The expedition company keeps most of that. The Sherpa who carries that client's gear, fixes the ropes, and often physically helps them to the summit might make $5,000 for the season, maybe less. And the death rate? Sherpas die on Everest at a much higher rate than Western climbers. They make more trips through the 𝐂𝐚𝐩𝐿 icefall. They carry heavier loads. They take more risks. Between 2004 and 2014, Sherpas accounted for nearly 40% of all Everest deaths, despite being a smaller percentage of people on the mountain. By 2013, when the confrontation with Steck happened, Sherpas had been raising concerns about safety and working conditions for years. They wanted better insurance, fairer compensation, more say in how the mountain was managed. But the climbing companies, the Nepalese government, and the international mountaineering community had been slow to respond. So when 3 European climbers seemingly ignored their warnings and climbed above them anyway, it wasn't just about that one day. It was about decades of being treated as disposable. And 1 year later, the deadliest disaster in Everest history would prove just how right the Sherpas were to be angry. The 2014 avalanche, April 18th, 2014. Almost exactly 1 year after the confrontation with Steck. 16 Sherpas were working in the 𝐂𝐚𝐩𝐿 icefall, fixing ropes and carrying loads for Western clients. It was early morning, the supposedly safest time to travel through the icefall before the sun warms the ice and increases avalanche risk. Without warning, a massive serac, a tower of glacial ice the size of a building, collapsed. The avalanche it triggered was catastrophic. 16 Sherpas were killed instantly. It was the deadliest single day in Everest history. The Sherpa community was devastated. These weren't just statistics. These were fathers, brothers, sons. Men from small mountain villages who'd taken dangerous jobs to support their families. And they died doing the work that makes Western climbers' summit dreams possible. In the wake of the tragedy, the Sherpas made an unprecedented decision. They went on strike. They refused to continue working on Everest that season. They demanded better death benefits for the families of the deceased, improved safety standards, more government regulation of the commercial climbing industry. The Nepalese government's initial offer was insulting. About $400 per family. After international pressure, they eventually raised it to about $10,000. Still a fraction of what most Western climbers were paying just to attempt the mountain. The strike held. For the first time in Everest's commercial climbing history, the season was essentially canceled. Without Sherpas, the mountain couldn't be climbed. At least not by the hundreds of commercial clients who depend on them. Western climbers who'd paid tens of thousands of dollars had to go home without summiting. The mountaineering world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. The entire system was built on exploitation. But would anything actually change? Or would the money and the pull of the summit prove too strong? The answer came sooner than anyone expected, and it involved an even deadlier disaster: the earthquake. Just when you'd think Everest couldn't get more tragic, something even worse happened. April 25, 2015, a massive 7.8 magnitude earthquake struck Nepal. The earthquake triggered avalanches throughout the Himalayas, including on Everest. At base camp, where hundreds of climbers, Sherpas, and support staff were stationed, an avalanche came roaring down without warning. People ran for their lives, but there was nowhere to go. The wall of ice and snow obliterated tents, gear, and people. 19 people were killed, including Sherpas and Western climbers. Over 120 were injured. The entire climbing season was canceled. Again. But beyond Everest, the earthquake was catastrophic for Nepal. Nearly 9,000 people died across the country. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes. The Sherpa villages that depend on climbing tourism were devastated both by the earthquake itself and by the economic impact of canceled expeditions. For the Sherpa community, it was a double tragedy. Not only had they lost friends and family in the avalanche and earthquake, but their livelihoods had disappeared. The tension between safety and economic survival became even more acute. Many Sherpas wanted better conditions, but they also desperately needed the income that climbing provided. When Everest reopened in 2016, some things had changed. Death benefits were slightly better. There was more discussion about Sherpa working conditions in the media. Some climbing companies started paying their Sherpas more fairly, but fundamentally, the system remained largely the same. So what happened to the 3 climbers at the center of the 2013 incident? Did they ever return to Everest? And more importantly, what does their story tell us about who really owns the world's tallest mountain? The answers might surprise you, because this story doesn't end the way you'd expect. Where are they now? Ueli Steck never returned to Everest after the 2013 incident, but he didn't stop climbing. In fact, he continued to push the boundaries of alpine climbing, completing incredible first ascents and speed records on some of the world's most difficult peaks. Then, in 2017, tragedy struck. Steck died in a climbing accident in Switzerland. He was descending from a training climb when he fell. The mountaineering world mourned the loss of one of the greatest alpinists of his generation. He was only 40 years old. Simone Moro also continued climbing after the Everest incident. He's known for his winter first ascents of major peaks, an incredibly dangerous specialty that few climbers attempt. He's also become an outspoken advocate for Sherpa rights and fair treatment of mountain workers, perhaps influenced by his experience in 2013. Jonathan Griffith continued his work as a climbing photographer and filmmaker. He's been relatively quiet about the 2013 incident in recent years, but has participated in several documentaries about Everest that touch on the complex relationship between Western climbers and Sherpas. As for the Sherpas involved in the confrontation, most have remained anonymous in the international press. The Sherpa who was allegedly the lead rope fixer that day continued working on Everest in subsequent seasons. The Sherpa community, for the most part, moved on from the incident, though it remains a significant moment in their collective memory of standing up for themselves. But here's the thing that often gets forgotten in all the focus on that one incident. The Sherpas were right. Everything they were angry about, the unfair pay, the dangerous conditions, the lack of respect, it was all real. And in the years since, even more evidence has emerged, showing just how exploitative the Everest industry had become. Yet, despite all this, people still climb Everest, hundreds every year. The mountain has actually gotten more crowded, not less. And the fundamental problems that led to the 2013 confrontation, many of them persist. So what's the solution? And is there even a right way to climb Everest anymore? The business of Everest today, fast forward to today, and Mount Everest is more commercialized than ever. In 2019, before the pandemic, there were images of climbers literally standing in line near the summit, waiting their turn to stand on top of the world. The line was so long that climbers were spending hours in the death zone above 26,000 feet, where the human body is slowly dying from lack of oxygen. That year, 11 people died on Everest, many of them attributed to overcrowding. Climbers who were already exhausted had to wait in freezing temperatures at extreme altitude, burning through their oxygen supplies while inexperienced climbers ahead of them took selfies at the summit. The Nepal government issues about 800 climbing permits per year, each costing $11,000. That's about $8.8 million just in permit fees, not counting the economic impact on local communities. For Nepal, one of the poorest countries in Asia, that revenue is significant. Too significant to risk by limiting permits or implementing stricter safety standards. Commercial expedition companies now offer packages that include oxygen from base camp, where most climbers don't need it, all the way to the summit. They promise summit success rates of 90% or higher. The mountain has become a tourist attraction, where money and determination matter more than actual climbing skill. And who makes it all possible? The Sherpas, of course. They're fixing the ropes, carrying the oxygen bottles, setting up the camps, and sometimes literally dragging exhausted clients to the summit and back down again. The risks they take haven't decreased. If anything, they've increased with overcrowding. Some Sherpas have become famous in their own right. 𝐂𝐚𝐸𝐻 Sherpa has summited Everest 30 times as of 2024, more than anyone in history. Mingma Sherpa runs his own climbing company. 𝐂𝐡𝐚𝐩𝐿 Sherpa, one of the most successful female Everest climbers ever, has summited 10 times while working as a dishwasher in the US between climbing seasons. But for every Sherpa who's achieved fame or business success, there are dozens more still working in dangerous conditions for inadequate pay. So the question remains, knowing all of this, should people even be climbing Everest anymore? And what would the mountain look like if we actually listened to what the Sherpas have been saying all along? What you're about to hear isn't just a story about Mount Everest. It's about fear, power, and a moment when the world's tallest mountain nearly turned into a battlefield. One decision, 3 elite climbers, and a confrontation so violent it exposed the darkest truth about Everest. A truth most people never see. If you enjoy deep, real stories from the most dangerous places on Earth, make sure you subscribe to the channel because these are the stories that don't make the headlines.